Welcome to Heaven and Earth. I'm joined by James Wood today, and we're going to talk. I think we'll talk about all sorts of things. I think we're going to talk about Henri de Lubac mainly, but we'll see what happens. So, James, could you just briefly introduce yourself so that people know who you are?
Yeah. My name's James. I am a PhD student at Wycliffe College at the University of Toronto. As we'll talk, I'm working on the Theology of Henri de Lubac. So we can get into that in a minute. But yeah, I'm originally from Austin, Texas. I went to the University of Texas there, and that's where I became a Christian through the ministry of Campus Crusade, which is now Cru. And I spent the first 6 years of my post-college life working for them as a staff and then campus director at my alma mater, which was a great joy. I loved working there, and I owe much of my life to Cru. Met my wife there as well. We got married in 2008. And at that point, I was also doing seminary. I was pursuing an MDiv at what used to be called Redeemer Seminary in Texas. Now was absorbed by RTS. That was a really great time for me. I became a student when I became a Christian, is one of the things I say. I didn't really love learning until two things related to my conversion. I think one being that there is a foundation, a secure foundation upon which to pursue learning. That God is a reality who wants to be known, and that reality is infinite and ever generous. And so, and also, I guess thirdly, it was related also to ministry. I really wanted to understand these important concepts and make sure I was representing God and his truth well to others, and also just understanding things that were going on in the lives of others to make sure I could be able to speak to them coherently. And that fell in love with the Bible and theology as I was doing ministry. So I went to seminary, did an MDiv, also became a pastor in the Presbyterian Church in America, and helped plant a church in Austin. And then I was encouraged, and I really did love that, but probably the most positive feedback I got during my pastoral ministry was teaching adult ed Sunday school classes, which I really started to come to realize how much I loved the dialogical nature of the classroom, way more than I like preaching. I like preaching, but when you preach to mostly white people, which I often did, they don't give you a lot of feedback in their sermons. I don't know if people
Well,
are
it's
that.
also a Presbyterian church, so
If they love it, if they hate it, it's this.
yeah, it's the exact same response.
Until you might get the complaining emails later,
Yeah.
but I really like the classroom setting, and so I was actually encouraged by my boss to consider a PhD, and I never thought I would do that. I'm the first person in my family actually to go to college, and this is all very new to me, but I'm really loving it. So that's where I am.
Yeah, it's funny. One thing you said that you kind of grew into a love of learning after becoming a Christian. It was the same for me, actually. It's not that I barely read before I was a Christian, basically uninterested in learning. But afterwards, I think the world becomes much more interesting and exciting.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
And there's like a need to know, I guess. I mean, earlier it was like a need to know like what the Bible says, but more and more now there's like this kind of thirst just to know what's real.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, we can get into de Lubac in a minute, but one thing I will say about that is one of the little metaphors he uses about just kind of human nature, how as we are created, that we're created with this ineliminable thirst that can be satisfied to a degree but never satiated, and he compares it really to knowledge. I mean, just thinking about the knowing endeavor, right, is another figure I really like is Michael Polanyi, this great 20th century scientist turned philosopher, theologian type person. But he talks about how the knowing endeavor works is that clues of reality that then you act upon, and then you get insights that strike you almost surprisingly, that are to some degree out of your control, and yet that insight then opens you up to what he calls indeterminate future manifestations, that you're always trying to put yourself in the position to receive those insights that never end. And anyway, and it's a great way to think about our relationship with God generally. It's just
yeah. I mean, maybe another way to put it is like, if we do have that thirst that you talked about for knowledge, or I guess I did, but you also talked about.
Yeah.
And God is infinite.
Yeah.
There's actually this laid out before us a sort of unending joy.
Yeah, that's right.
But
And you're not if you have a proper view of knowledge, right? It's when your ignorance is exposed, but it's exposed by further insight. It doesn't shame you; it excites you for more. You just want more
Right.
and more and more and more.
And you can apply it to different sorts of like someone who's a great carpenter can build something beautiful and perfect better than before.
Yeah.
And that sort of gain is really satisfying.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's the same thing with intellectual work as well.
Yeah.
Which I would actually say those are similar intellectual works. They're just different applications of it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I one of the best summaries a professor ever gave me of the life of a scholar, or he just gave this definition as a scholar. He said, "What is a scholar?" Well, a scholar is just a lifelong learner.
Yeah.
And I think that has grounded me in just even the pursuit of PhD. Right? I mean, if there's a PhD student, I think a lot of people probably look at PhD students and think that they're probably very arrogant, and a lot of them are. But I view it as a constant process of humility, of being humbled. Every step of the way, you just learn how much you don't know, but it's exciting. So,
well, I like the way you are kind of talking about this because I do think in Christian circles you almost view the PhD as like getting a sufficient amount of data to say that you know a topic, and then it's like, okay, so why would you do a PhD if you're in Christian circles or Christian ministry? It appears to be kind of like it's great, you can just read some books.
Yeah.
At least as I understand it, like doing a PhD disciplines your mind to know how to think well, and also it gives you the tools to know how to grow well. And then I actually like, maybe you could talk about this a little bit. I actually feel people love that. Like it's almost the case that we want to like ultra dumb things down, but actually, I mean, people listen to 3-hour podcasts on detailed topics, and they love it. And so what are we doing wrong? Like I mean, maybe a 3-hour sermon's an extreme example, but 3 hours teaching on something.
Yeah.
Like we would never want to do that in a church setting. And yet people in our pews will listen to a 3-hour podcast on some science topic or whatever it is. So what's going on here, do you think?
Well, I know how I listen to podcasts, which is at 2x speed. So you can't do that with your pastor.
Well, you're doing something else or whatever, but yeah.
Oh, I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. I don't find I that is way beyond my pay grade of knowing how to appeal to modern audiences. Anyway, so, but yeah, I think those are questions worth asking. If you're saying something significant and you're connecting hard, beautiful truths to the real needs of people, that should
connect,
satisfy a need.
I don't know. I guess I find it interesting that you have people love Google Talks, TED Talks, podcasts with experts, but then there's a huge audience for that. And then a lot of times in Christian settings, we think, well, people are uninterested in what we have to say or aren't willing to listen into detailed conversation. So I just think it's a weird side-by-side thing. Like what is it that's going on? And it's beyond your pay grade. And I guess I don't really have an answer. Like I don't have the answer. There's various factors that build into it. I think there's a culture where maybe we haven't shown that can be interesting.
Yeah, and I think the pandemic is reminding us of certain things too, which is that maybe it's also good that people don't just want long sermons and long form content in an intellectual mode for Christian formation, but they want to be with God's people. And I pray that that's true. I mean, it's a real prayer for me after this pandemic largely abates and people can, to some degree, be back together. I do pray that people get back together and actually don't continue just to do 3-hour podcasts as a spiritual supplement, substitute for the live gathering of God's people. So anyway, hopefully that's true.
Well, I'll put it this way. I suspect most of us, if you're not living in Texas, are wanting to see people again and get out and do things. And I say that I actually think it's probably creating, people are realizing that, I think, because you're realizing that maybe you're more lonely than you would have been.
Yeah.
Let's if we could maybe transition for a second. I'm curious to learn a little bit about de Lubac, who is, I mean, he's a guy that's characterized by learning, I would say.
Yeah.
And has a long career. So maybe just, can you give me like the 30-second elevator pitch for this guy, like why someone should know who he is?
Yeah, I can do this elevator pitch, and then maybe I can.
And then you can do like the real talk.
Well, then I can summarize how I got into him, and then we can see where it goes from there. So he is just a fact. You said he had a long career, and that actually is relevant. So he was born 1896 and died 1991. So basically, the whole 20th century he lived. And what's fascinating is he was at the center of almost everything really important in theology in the 20th century, other than Barth. Like, he wasn't Barth, but he's kind of the he's really a counterpart to Barth. I think he's probably the other most important theologian of the 20th century. If you're not, and I say important, I'm not saying the best. I'm not saying either of them are the best. I would even say that about de Lubac. De Lubac is probably not even the best Catholic theologian of the 20th century. So I'm fine saying that. But if you want to really understand what happened in the 20th century, you have to understand Barth in theology, and I think you'd have to really understand de Lubac. But let me just kind of give some bullet points of what he was a part of. So he was in France, and he was born into France as the increasing separation between church and state was happening. And it really culminated in the first decade of the 20th century, 1901 to 1905. You see all these laws of separation happening. And then what's called the Modernist Crisis in Catholic theology, where the Catholic Church is really trying to wrestle with how do we engage the modern world, and especially like liberal democracy. Should we just oppose them and reject them because they're so anti-clerical and things like that? And so he was involved at that at the beginning. He also served in World War I and was injured. He was forced to serve in World War I because after the separation of church and state, there was no longer a clerical exception to serving, so they were drafted. And so he served. And then in between the wars, he was very involved in what's called the Nouvelle Theology, the renewal of Catholic theologies that tries to engage the modern world. And then in World War II, he was one of the few prominent resistors to Nazism and anti-Semitism. Everybody knows Dietrich Bonhoeffer and maybe Barth, how they resisted. The reason you know them is because they're the exception to the rule. There weren't a lot of great Christian figures resisting during that time, but de Lubac was one. He was at the center of the resistance in France. And then he was censured for 10 years after the war because of some provocative writings that he wrote that I can talk about in a minute. But then he was restored at Vatican II. He was emeritus, a father of the council, one of the leading theologians. And he eventually becomes a cardinal by his friend John Paul II. And I would say also some of the figures that he's most closely associated with are, besides all these French people in the Nouvelle Theology, which I can talk about later, but he was also a mentor to von Balthasar and Joseph Ratzinger, who's becomes Pope Benedict XVI. And he was good friends with John Paul II. His theology influenced things like radical orthodoxy. So he's a leading kind of inspiration for John Milbank.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and I can talk about that in a minute. But he also his theology also influenced, though he later critiqued it, influenced the emergence of liberation theology under Gustavo Gutierrez. Gutierrez attributes a lot of inspiration to de Lubac. But I would say that the last thing I'll say is de Lubac is fascinating. If you looked at the beginning of his career and saw that he was kind of wanting the Catholic Church to open up to the modern world, was kind of a defender of the rights of human persons, resisted the Nazis. I think you'd be often surprised at his writings after the council, where he was very critical, kind of some progressive theology.
So Vatican II is what you mean by the
after Vatican II, he was very critical of some progressive theological trends, and very critical of in the 60s and 70s, the emerging political theologies that were much more progressive, including liberation theology. So yeah, he's just fascinating. So there you go.
So the term Nouvelle Theologie, was that kind of a critical phrase used against him, and then it became okay?
Yes, it sounds like you read a little bit about that. Yeah, so Father Garrett Lagrange is was one of the leading opponents of what.
Oh.
And Yeah, so you might have Gary Lagrange is a very interesting
I have a book of his right here.
Yeah, philosopher, theologian, very interesting. And he wrote this famous essay in the mid 30s or maybe early 40s. Now I can't remember, but it basically was titled "The New Theology: Where Is It Going?" And he, but it's kind of a critical, kind of a scathing innuendo. He's kind of implicating, hey, it's kind of heading in a very progressive trajectory. And I could talk about what de Lubac was doing there, but maybe I'll wait to see if there's further questions. But yeah, it was, and de Lubac himself also never appropriated that term for himself.
And he's, am I right to say he's close to Jean Danielou?
Yeah, so Jean Danielou, Yves Congar, to a degree, was involved in it. Dominique Chenu, Marie-Dominique Chenu, Gaston Fessard. Those are some of the key figures early on. Henri Bouillard, some of the key figures early on in the Nouvelle Theology. And I guess maybe an introduction to what those guys were doing is
that'd be good.
Yeah, they were trying to. It's related to your question about why our preaching doesn't relate to the world. De Lubac and those figures were very critical of the Catholic theology of their day, that they labeled the neo-scholasticism of Catholic theology in the late 19th to early 20th century. You could kind of summarize it as the manualist Thomism. Just basically, it was in their mind, it was a very lifeless, propositional dogmatism that didn't offer many opportunities to engage current thought. They labeled it building off of another influence on de Lubac, a major influence on de Lubac. There are three major influences on de Lubac: Augustine Thomas and a modern philosopher named Maurice Blondel. And Maurice Blondel labeled these types of thinkers associated with neo-scholasticism as a separated theology. It was theology that didn't seek any sort of contact with the world around it.
Was Blondel a what's the word, phenomenologist kind of philosopher?
I mean, you can associate with that, right? I mean, because phenomenology is kind of a big catch-all term in the 20th century, and you could definitely, because the way that he would be most associated with that is he does start kind of from the ground up in his thinking, and with what he calls the method of imminence, rather than the doctrine of imminence, which he rejects. He's not an immanentist in his thought, but he does start with kind of ground up realities. And in his doctoral dissertation called L'Action, he makes a really provocative argument that every single one of our actions in the world, and even really every single one of our intellectual activities, is already oriented to transcendent realities at kind of the most structural, fundamental level, even if we can't articulate it. And so it's kind of like if you ask someone, like, why do you do what you do? Right? You can do kind of an infinite regress.
Yeah, of
it's
reasons.
So you could do that. Like, well, I go to school, whatever, I go to school, get money. Why do I get money? Eventually, but he says at the end of that process, you'll find out that there's a transcendent longing that nothing in this world can fill, a la C.S. Lewis, right? If I find in my heart a longing for a world, desiring things that cannot be satisfied in this world, what that exposes to me, what it reveals to me, is that was made for another world. So Blondel doesn't ever quote that, that was written later, but similar idea that all of our actions are expressing an internal, innate, ineliminable desire for the supernatural. Wow. And then de Lubac appropriates that and provides it with more theological sophistication.
Interesting. I sidetracked you. I don't think we yet defined Nouvelle Theologie. I think I sidetracked because I asked about Blondeau.
Yeah, so they were critiquing that neo-scholastic thought that was, in their mind, lifeless, just propositional type theology that didn't connect with the world. And they tried to renew Catholic theology to connect with the modern world, but by returning to the sources, an ad fontes movement within Roman Catholicism.
Yeah.
And so they try to go back behind the Thomistic interpreters to Thomas himself, and behind Thomas himself to the Christian tradition. And so so they were a part of this kind of Catholic ressourcement movement. So Nouvelle Theologie and ressourcement are kind of they are closely connected terms. And that's interesting because there's a progressive dynamism and a traditional one at the same time. And de Lubac would argue the only way to renew theology is to resource it.
Yeah. So in Protestant circles, you might think of someone like Thomas Oden.
Yeah.
He's a Wesleyan who would do something similar. The retrieval or theological interpretation guys.
All kinds of guys. I mean, and even the reformers themselves, right? I mean, they were trying to critique the Catholicism of their day.
Well, that might be a point just to briefly camp on, because you talked about theology as kind of an ad fontes movement.
Yes,
So ad fontes is just a humanist term to say you should go back to the sources in order to determine what they mean.
Yep.
And Protestants, reformers in particular, found that really valuable, primarily with scripture, but also secondarily and alongside to the early church. And so this is kind of why, like, if you read, especially after the first like decade or so of reformers end up having huge swathes of arguments that include what the church fathers said. Because well, there are some exceptions. For the most part, they're trying to say that we are the Reformed church of ancient days. And they use this retrieval to demonstrate a sort of connection point, however you want to term it.
And that's really one of the reasons. It's one of the reasons I got into de Lubac, because I found a similar spirit. And
go on.
But I wanted to say one more thing, and I'll come back to that. Is he also, de Lubac did, he wrote on everything. That's what's also really fun about him. And von Balthasar said that about it. He's like, you when you look at his corpus, it's intimidating because he has over 40 published books, and then a million other, a bunch of other articles. But they write on everything.
Doesn't he have like a trillion books?
Yeah, I mean, so and de Lubac famously said about Balthasar, he's the most cultured man in Christendom. I mean, de Lubac, he's also just a godly man. He was willing to compliment bigger minds than himself publicly. But he also, so de Lubac did a lot with theology, but he also was part of, one of the other reasons why he's important in the 20th century is he also was one of the major critics of like modern historical criticism. And he wrote one of his major books that I'm trying to in every very virulently to avoid, because there's so many things I have to touch on with my de Lubac research, trying to avoid his 4 massive volumes on medieval exegesis.
Yeah.
I mean, they're huge.
If you're watching this on video, here's the first volume in English translation.
Yeah, there's 4 of them, and they're huge. And I think they each one gets bigger. And so what he primarily retrieves is the medieval and also basically ancient hermeneutical method of the quadriga, right? And the fourfold method of exegesis, and that includes historical considerations, but there's more spirituality involved. And so anyway, so he does some ad fontes things there. I mean, even with biblical interpretation. And so you see a similar spirit to a lot of Reformed thinking. That's why I found him when I first started reading about him, and then reading him, I was like, this is really an ecumenical figure that also I can learn from, because he's also engaging different conversations that I'm used to. So he's providing me all these other really fascinating conceptual categories that I otherwise probably just wouldn't have.
Well, this whole group of people that are part of his nebulous circle are those who have created critical editions of church fathers, works of historical, enlightenment of what they mean. Like I'm reading now, just on my desk, one of these volumes from the Source Chrétien series on Athanasius.
Yep. So
and Jean Denis is one of the main guys behind Source Chrétien. Who else is? Anyone else in that circle?
Lubac would be, and Daniel I think those would be the 2 main figures. Yes, so the Source Chrétien movement was one of the original projects of patristic retrieval in the 20th century.
And so maybe just because just to reiterate, it's like one of the values of knowing these people is that if you're a Christian, if you're a Protestant in particular, the idea of ad fontes is sort of built into our DNA. And so you want to be able to read Athanasius to know what he says by the words he uses according to a good critical edition. And these guys have done a lot of the spade work for us.
Yeah.
And they're relatively affordable compared to some of the other university volumes out there anyways.
Yeah.
I mean, relative is relative. I mean, this book's like $50 or whatever.
Are you reading in the French then, huh? No?
Yeah, well, yes.
There you go.
Well, it's French and Greek, right? So
okay. Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah. So it's my go-to kind of series for things. Source Chrétien.
Yeah. So he, the other interesting thing that people might be interested to know about him, and this is one of the reasons why, and this will be really reformed, a really reformed tie, is he provides a fascinating account for the emergence of modern secularism. And then he provides really interesting resources to combat it. And the way he does it, so and one of the things I'm doing in organizing my dissertation is de Lubac has three major genealogies to account for basically how we got here. It's kind of history of ideas and developments and movements of kind of how we got here. I'll list, maybe I'll just come back to two of them. I'll just, the first major one is how in theology, from basically the end of the 14th through the 17th century, he sees these new concepts being introduced called pure nature. Theologians and Christian philosophers introduced an idea of pure nature, where coming up with a conception of man that could be, in some sense, have his nature satisfied apart from God and in this worldly realities. And then de Lubac kind of traces out how that gets worked out, how it gets developed, and how that then leads to a separated theology, because now theology doesn't really have to take into consideration human social historical considerations, but just develops its own reflections on these supernatural realities that have no intrinsic connection to the natural. And therefore secular thought, social political thought, deems theology completely irrelevant to its own ordering. But he then argues what's so fascinating, and this is why he's also fascinating too, because he's critiquing his own tradition. He's critiquing Catholicism. He's saying we are complicit in the emergence of modern secularism. It was problems in our own thought that led to this. And that's just a fascinating argument that shifts in Catholic theology led in his mind to modern secularism. But one of the reasons why I liked, and so he's arguing there's no such thing as pure nature. What is that? Nature is created by God and for God, right? And nature, humanity will not be satisfied apart from God. And therefore there's no square, you start to think, there's no square inch under all of creation over which Christ does not claim mine. It sounds, it starts to sound like, oh, there's almost a Kuyperianism in this. And yet he provides completely different conceptual resources to make a similar claim. And part of the reason why I was really drawn to de Lubac, in contradistinction even to like a Kuyper, besides maybe other issues in Kuyper's own thought, is de Lubac resists secularism without trying to either do two things, without trying to impose ecclesial rule on the social order. So he wouldn't align with the integralists, especially that's resurged recently, but also at the same time without losing the church at the center of the social order. And that's something, as I read a lot of all of Kuyper's newly translated works, and and then also read the major biography by Bratt. One of the most disheartening things about in reading that biography by Bratt was at the end you start to realize, man, in like the last 20 years of Kuyper's life, he didn't even go to church.
Oh, really?
And spent more time writing about politics. That's what Bratt highlights at the end of his biography. Spent his Sunday mornings reading the newspaper and writing his column. And in my thought, and one of the things I've commented on about that is that's when common grace goes wrong. And so I think de Lubac, and he gave me some resources to see another way out of that conundrum. How to resist secularism, how to resist the square inch apart from Jesus, without imposing church authority over the world, but also without losing the church at the center. So anyway, I'll pause there. I don't have to talk forever, but
no, it's interesting. I like that you connected to Abraham Kuyper. Yeah. And so I've read his Stone lectures. Yeah. And I guess he has a connection to this idea, sphere, sovereignty. But I'm no sort of big expert on him. But my impression is that I like Bavinck more than Kuyper, without really having done enough work to have a good judgment on that. But that's an interesting connection. You talked about
and I think the connection there in many ways is really rounding out what you think about nature, human nature, and that's where de Lubac ties with Blondel, and it's where he does something a little different. He starts to work out his thoughts on the social order, on even kind of an incipient political theology, which I'm trying to then tease out the contours of that. But he starts with human nature. So one of his famous phrases is the natural desire for the supernatural. Human nature naturally desires union and communion with God, with the supernatural, and then specifically with God. And that's an ineliminable part of human nature. So it doesn't conflate nature and grace or nature and the supernatural. There's distinction, but there's an integral relation that then brings out a certain dynamism.
So when I hear you say that, my mind went to two places. One, to Augustine's, our hearts are restless until they find rest in you. So there's a real sense in which Augustine has observed, I think Christians do too, that humans are meant for God.
That's actually a key phrase in his social ontology.
Okay.
He quotes that everywhere.
Augustine. Okay.
He quotes, that's one of his favorite quotes. So I said the three major figures on him are, but everybody's, if you're a Catholic, your two major figures you have to at least say they are Augustine and Thomas. But they are for him, and Blondel. But he sees in Blondel a very Augustinian sentiment, like hearts are restless. And so if that's the case, and so here's another fascinating thing why I like him so much. If that's the case, if you tie that to the human sociality, if we have social desires that can't be satisfied apart from the supernatural community, also that God creates, then that's going to really play out upon our political imagination. And it's going to play out in the sense that if you reject, for instance, God's ordering, but not only his ordering, but his divine community, the human divine community in the church. Human divine because it's the body of Christ filled with the Spirit, and it's made of humans that are regenerate, and also unregenerate people that are involved. But if you reject that at the center of your social imagination, what you will end up with, and this is what de Lubac really teases out in a really fascinating way, which already presages what Charles Taylor then works out and others. You will get the emergence of secular religions, secular political religions, if you see, because those social desires cannot be eliminated, and they're going to be met somewhere. And so what he does in one of his first major works called The Drama of Atheist Humanism is so he looks at Nietzsche, Comte, and Marx and Feuerbach. He says these are
that's how you say his name, Feuerbach, not Few. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. These are figures that are trying to basically replace God in their social imagination and create secular religions.
The other thing that I was reminded of, and I think it actually fits better now that you've explained more, is I think if you're a Christian, you have to affirm that grace does not destroy nature, but perfects it or completes it. Yeah. And so if I'm hearing you correct, de Lubac is saying something like, our natural social desires are for something. Mm-hmm. Blondeau will kind of tell us that if you keep going back through the causation chain, it's really a transcendental thing that we want. Yeah. And what you're saying is, in an interpretation of a secular society, the social desire gets caught up in whatever the secular religious, could be anything, could be commercialism, whatever, or desire of some sort. And so that's helpful, because I think even because at least as a Protestant, I want to say, look, we do have total depravity, and yet there is something true that we all want by nature. We all want love, we all want communion, all these kinds of things. The fact that we sin like crazy doesn't destroy whatever that natural desire is. And the gospel in particular is an offer to I guess return you to your creator.
disordered loves, right? I mean, that would be the
It's a
Augustine.
disordered love, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, your depraved nature, which de Lubac actually is fascinating.
But he would have to affirm, correct? Like, I mean,
he actually develops more of that line of thinking in one of his late works in 1980 called Brief Catechesis on Nature and Grace. I always just say, by the way, if anybody's looking for an introduction to us, that might be the easiest book to really get what he's doing, and you don't have to know a lot of technical terms or anything like that. That late book called A Brief Catechesis on Nature and Grace is really good, and it sounds in many places very reformed, which is really fascinating. But yeah, what you said is right, and that's where I think Reformed theology. I know there are really great Reformed people that are being retrieved now that have more of this, but a general weakness in Reformed theology oftentimes is we don't have a really robust theology of nature, other than it's depraved, and I think that's why the grace, that is more Thomistic, which we can claim, Thomas, right? I mean, that is a more Thomistic sensibility, right? Which is grace does not destroy, but perfects and elevates nature to some degree, and that's where de Lubac would agree, right? Like, and what you said is, with our depraved nature, our orders are we have disordered loves, but the structurality doesn't go away. That we must love something, we must worship something. That's Calvin. It's just Calvin, right? Like, our hearts are idol factories.
That's it, and so.
And so that love is going to go somewhere.
It's one of the things. So there's a couple things. At least one thing I want to say actually is you mentioned that de Lubac maybe sounds Protestant. One of the things that I think is really interesting, a lot of these guys who were in the retreat or the Resistance movement, they're retrieving the theology of the church fathers in the same way we would, and appropriating them maybe for their own ends or whatever. And there's a real sense in which it's odd, because you can read some of these authors and like, yeah, it's great. Because what they're repeating Augustine or Athanasius or Irenaeus or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And yet there are some downstream, obviously some real downstream differences. Like, I don't know if de Lubac has like anything on Mary, but sometimes it's funny when you'll read someone and then you'll get to like this section on like, oh, okay, I guess there is a downstream difference.
Yeah. So that comes out. I mean, it does. I mean, and de Lubac mentioned, there's a quote from, and he's read all these Protestants, but there's a quote that he has from, I'm not going to find the book now, but that he has from Barth, where he basically says like, Catholic theology is, and he said Barth would say like it's too shaped by Mariology. And de Lubac says it is, and that's what makes it good. So, and it's probably my favorite book on the church, really, to be honest. Maybe my other one would be, but it's just too short. Would be New Begins Little Book, Household of God. But probably my other favorite book on the church is de Lubac's lectures in this book called The Splendor of the Church. It's just a beautiful book, and that's another thing I was drawn to him too. Is de Lubac loves the church, and so do I. Like, maybe I'll say this briefly and then we'll get back to the Mary thing, is I became a Christian through Christian community. Like, I became a Christian by watching groups of Christians in fellowship with one another and them inviting me into it through hospitality. And I began asking
which I think is most people, really.
And I do. And so, and I remember,
if it's not your family.
Yeah. And I remember Jamie Smith, I was at a session with him where he actually shared this one time, where he was talking about why he wrote the Cultural Liturgies Project. And I remember him saying this offhanded quote, which I thought was just beautiful because it related to me so much. He's like, he said, I'm just trying to give a philosophical account for the fact that I was loved into the kingdom by a group of Christians. And I was like, you know what? That is really me in a lot of ways. I was loved unto Jesus by a group of people who claimed to know him, and that knowledge of him and being loved by him shaped the way they interacted with each other and shaped their hospitality towards me. They were imperfect, obviously, but they were different. And I think a lot of people, who maybe grew up in the church, who've been in the church for too long and only see its flaws, are forgetting how beautiful the church is. And I told my wife this, I was like, like we've moved quite a bit in our adult life. And I was like, let me just tell you how amazing this is. I know that every single city or town that we go to in any part of the world almost, that there's a group of Christians that I can walk into the door and they are obligated to love me. Like, like who else has that? Like who else has that? And that love is real because Jesus gives it to us, right? And so de Lubac loves the church, and I do too. And I think, and just in a lot of modern writings, or that doesn't come out. And so he's got this beautiful book called The Splendor of the Church, and it's amazing. And one of the best chapters in it is the chapter on the church's sacrament. And that is actually what I'm grounding my research in, which I can get to in a second. But then he does have a long Marian chapter at the end, which is fascinating.
Yeah, it's always, sometimes it's shocking. Like you'll read something like, oh yeah, it's a great, and you're like, huh. And at least for me, I find it jarring.
But he actually does try to temper the.
I'm sure he does.
He does try to temper the modern Marianism. I mean, there is something beautiful about having a high Mariology to a degree, not to the excesses that the contemporary Catholic theology takes it, but it's just having a really beautiful picture, other than Jesus himself, who is the ultimate picture of creaturely agency in union with the divine. This receptivity in this participation. There's a beauty to that, and so that's what he develops it, because he does see Mary giving a good analog for what the church is. So
does he get into any of the sophiology debates?
Fascinating you asked that, because I've published on that. I didn't.
Oh, okay. There you go.
I didn't know you're interested in the sophiology.
I don't know that I'm a lurker on the outside to things.
So did you get into them through Milbank?
No, through a Russian Eastern Orthodox theologian whose name I can't remember.
Sergei Bulgakov?
Yeah, Bulgakov.
So the paper that I published is on him.
Okay.
In a journal called Logos, an Eastern Christian Studies journal, but it's actually related to my de Lubac research. Sorry, somebody called me. But Milbank is how I found out about Bulgakov. Milbank has this little book called The Suspended Middle, which is about de Lubac, right here, The Suspended Middle. But in it, he actually mentions he actually mentions Bulgakov as having a very similar project as de Lubac, and Milbank argues that they're the two most important theologians in the 20th century. Clearly marginalized the part, but because they're both have this really robust sense of the intrinsic or integral relation between nature and grace, nature and the supernatural. And what sophiology adds to that is it adds a certain dynamism via divine Sophia. That divine Sophia, which is really complex. It's Mary, the church, and then also the Holy Spirit to a degree. It's kind of all three in these fascinating ways. But it's also built into the structure of just created existence, in that in the structure of created existence, nature has this internal telos in the divine, but it's also it's kind of there's a real dynamism to that through Sophia, that it keeps pushing that direction. So it adds something a little unique, but it's a similar thing to de Lubac. So.
Well, I think it's been an interesting conversation. I think we should, so as not to take all the time that you have in the world, maybe land somewhere.
Sure.
Why don't there's so many things we could talk about. Like, I'm curious about Lubac, the way he resolves some of the modernist stuff, his involvement in Vatican II.
Yeah.
Well, why don't you just tell me, maybe in your own words, what are you arguing in your dissertation, and how does he help you get to where you want to go?
Yeah, I mean, I can read you a one-sentence summary of my project.
That if you have a one-sentence summary, you're like ahead of everybody else.
So I guess it's maybe 2 sentences. So
never mind then.
Yeah. So my thesis is called "The Sacrament in the Secular: The Socio-Political Significance of Henri de Lubac's Sacramental Ecclesiology in a Post-Christian World." But what I argue there is that the socio-political vision that emerges from de Lubac's overall thought can be summarized as what I call an ecclesial humanism, which is actually a phrase that I stole from Bulgakov. Bulgakov refers to his theology as an ecclesial humanism. But this concept, this is the sentence that summarizes it. This concept reflects de Lubac's quest for a positive and integral relation between human nature and salvation, and between salvation and the church. the image of sacrament for the church, that's what I'm developing, functions to foreground three essential aspects of salvation. Salvation for de Lubac, according to Lubac, is social, supernatural, and what he means by that is distinct from, integrally related to, but beyond the grasp of nature. So social, supernatural, and mediated. Together, these three constitute the church as the indispensable social embodiment of goods that are in excess of finite human capacities.
You're using the phrase before, oh, sorry, go on.
No, yeah, so that's the summary of what I'm doing, and then kind of spell out kind of what that means.
You're used a phrase that at least a couple times that I don't understand. You're talking about the church's sacrament.
Yep.
But I don't understand that in the singular. What do you mean?
Yeah. So that phrase is that image of the church is one of the key contributions that de Lubac makes in the 20th century as well. That thought then gets enshrined in Vatican II's documents, especially Lumen Gentium, which is the major dogmatic constitution on the theology of the church. So all throughout Lumen Gentium, which just means light of the nations, that's a primary understanding of what the church is.
The church as a sacramental character, is this kind of the sense?
Yeah, and so de Lubac isn't the only person in the 20th century that works on that. Karl Rahner is another guy who helps. He has a little book on the church and the sacraments, and he makes that argument too. And
he's got an interesting rule people talk about.
Rahner's rule, yes. Which in it, Rahner, okay, I don't want to get caught up. One thing I'll say about Rahner is having read more of Rahner directly, I think people caricature him. So I obviously, de Lubac drastically disagrees with Rahner after Vatican II, and so do I. But a lot of the secondary literature that I read about Rahner, I felt like didn't really give him a fair shake. Anyway, but yeah, the church is a sacrament that it's a, and that's really, I guess where you would tie it to, and where you could see the real proper grounding of it, and also the salience of it is okay. Well, the church is the body of Christ, and what else is the body of Christ? The Eucharist. And so de Lubac has, he really helped retrieve the integral relationship between Eucharist and Ecclesia. That was part of the patristic and early medieval imagination that gets lost. It's one of the other genealogies he works out, is that gets lost in the mid to late medieval period. And that then what happens is with the Eucharist, we get obsessed with the elements. We get obsessed with what happens to the elements, and it becomes a very atomized view of what the Eucharist.
I'm not obsessed with the elements.
Yes, but a lot of medieval and even early
maybe I am.
And Peter Leiter has a really great article on this called "The Way Things Ought to Be," and he talks about the zoom lens versus the wide-angle lens on the Eucharist. But
someone has said something to the effect is that in the medieval church, the Eucharist was basically like astrophysics, or like there's just like this high level thinking thing. But
yeah, so I'm not a medievalist, but I will. What de Lubac does with trying to retrieve a medieval sensibility about the Eucharist is there is a real interconnection between the Eucharist and the church. That the phrase he uses is that the Eucharist makes the church, and the church makes the Eucharist. And that's because the church has its being in Christ and his gift of life to us that then we share with one another. And so, but then even just in sacramental theology, right, you start to have a more social imagination in your sacramental theology. It's not just about what you individually are getting in these elements. It's about what God is doing in the community, what God is doing in his people. And so de Lubac really tries to retrieve that sense that has been lost.
All I'm seeing is it sounds very Protestant to me.
That's what I'm saying. That sounds like a lot of people like you might look at me and think like, gosh, is James just a closet papist who hates Reformed theology? I'm like, well, actually, I think if you read de Lubac, you'd be surprised that he's a bridge for us in a lot of ways, and could be really an ecumenical resource. But also that the church itself is a sacrament because it is the body of Christ. And he argues that it's, in a sense, other than the historical body of Christ, Jesus incarnate and ascended, other than that, it's the primary one, that the Eucharist is ultimately primarily referencing to the church and Jesus as well. But then the church itself is the divinely instituted visible sign in the world of God's action and presence. And therefore, this is where it will come up against a Protestant sensibility, is he has a higher view of mediation. And I'm less allergic to that than a lot of Protestants are. I get the arguments, but already if you have like a theology of the keys of the kingdom, there's something already happening there, in a sense of intermediaries or something, whatever language you want to use that doesn't get you afoul of Reformed theology. There's already something about like God is using his people. He chooses to use instruments in the world, and he uses the sacraments, and he uses the people, which also are a sacrament. And so the church is the divinely instituted sign of God's presence in the world, and it itself unites transcendent and human realities, and bridges between heaven and earth.
Well, I feel like, James, I learned a lot of things I didn't know. I have some stuff by Lubac. I have a book on angels by him that's interesting.
Yeah.
And this one on medieval exegesis, and the rest on Kindle. But I do appreciate him and others who have, like, my main interest is reading really old fuddy-duddy texts like Athanasius and so on.
Yeah.
And so I'm thankful that they've done the historical and critical work, this group of people in the Nouvelle Theologie circle, so that I can read and enjoy patristic and early medieval, well, I guess late patristic theology. So it's been interesting to learn more about him from you and to get to know you. Actually, we never met before. I met you on Twitter, and I was like, oh, okay, let's talk.
We did meet at that ETS.
A couple years ago.
Yeah, a couple years ago. Yeah.
Sorry.
No, that's right. I presented on Calvin. I actually presented on a Protestant.
Oh, were we in the library room together?
Yeah.
Like on the little round table?
Yeah.
And then was Steve Chester there as well at one point?
Oh gosh, I can't remember. I just remember Radner was there, and he was Ephraim Radner was on my committee.
Right, that's right. And then Radner was there because he was your. Okay, I actually kind of remember this now.
Yeah, and he grilled me, so appropriately. It's good.
Yeah. Huh. Well, that's funny. Well, I don't know if you're back up in Toronto and we're allowed to meet. We should have another ETS together. All right, friend. It was fun to talk to you, and have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, man. Thanks, I appreciate it.